I never thought betrayal could feel so physical, like someone reaching inside your chest and squeezing your heart until you can't breathe. But that's exactly what happened when I realized my own mother had chosen her afternoon nap over being there. For the most terrifying moment of my life, the contractions had started at 3 in the morning, sharp and relentless, like someone was twisting a knife in my lower back every few minutes. I had called them immediately, my voice shaking as I explained that the baby was coming early, that I was scared, that I needed them. Dad had answered, his voice groggy but concerned, promising they would be there as soon as possible. That was 8 hours ago. 8 hours of agony, of begging the nurses to call them again, of watching other families rush in with flowers and excited faces while I labored alone in a sterile room that smelled of disinfectant and broken dreams. The worst part wasn't even the physical pain, though that was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was the emotional devastation of realizing that when I needed them most, when their first grandchild was about to enter the world, they had simply decided that other things were more important. I had always known our relationship was complicated, but I never imagined they could be this cruel, this indifferent to my suffering. The nurse, a kind woman named Sarah with tired eyes and gentle hands, had been my only source of comfort. She held my hand during the worst contractions, spoke to me in soothing tones, and even tried calling my parents herself when she saw how distressed I was becoming. But each call went straight to voicemail, and with each unanswered ring, another piece of my heart broke. I kept thinking about all the times they had promised to be there for me. All the conversations about how excited they were to become grandparents. All the baby preparations we had done together. Had it all been lies? Had they ever really cared about me at all? The labor progressed slowly, painfully, and I found myself wondering if this was some kind of cosmic punishment for something I had done wrong. Maybe I had been a difficult daughter. Maybe I had disappointed them too many times. Maybe this was their way of teaching me a lesson about independence and self-reliance. But what kind of lesson required abandoning your child during one of the most vulnerable moments of her life? The doctor, a professional woman in her 50s who had delivered hundreds of babies, seemed genuinely concerned about my emotional state. She had seen plenty of women give birth without family support, but there was something about my situation that clearly troubled her. She kept glancing at the door, as if expecting my parents to burst through at any moment with apologies and explanations, but the door remained stubbornly closed. As the hours dragged on and my exhaustion deepened, I began to feel a strange kind of clarity emerging from the fog of pain and disappointment. This was not just about a missed birth or a broken promise. This was about a pattern of behavior that had been building for years, a gradual erosion of trust and respect that I had been too afraid or too hopeful to acknowledge. They had always been self-centered, always found excuses to prioritize their own comfort over my needs. But somehow I had convinced myself that this time would be different. That the birth of their first grandchild would be important enough to break through their usual selfishness. I was wrong. And the realization was almost as painful as the contractions themselves. The afternoon sun was streaming through the hospital window when I finally understood the full scope of their betrayal. A text message, sent at 2 in the afternoon, 8 hours after I had begged them to come. Sorry, sweetie. Mom needed her rest after yesterday's shopping trip. We'll come by tomorrow when things have settled down. Hope everything goes well. Hope everything goes well. As if childbirth was a casual event they could drop by for at their convenience, like a neighborhood barbecue or a school play. I stared at that message until the words blurred together, my hands trembling with a mixture of exhaustion and rage. The nurse Sarah had been checking on me every few minutes, her concern growing more evident with each visit. She had worked in labor and delivery for 15 years, she told me, and she had never seen parents miss their child's birth for such a trivial reason. Her own mother had driven through a blizzard to be there when she gave birth to her first child, arriving covered in snow but beaming with excitement. That was what family was supposed to do, she said gently. They were supposed to show up, especially for the big moments. Her words were meant to be comforting, but they only deepened my sense of isolation and abandonment. I began to wonder if other patients could hear me crying between contractions, if they were whispering about the poor girl in room 12, whose own parents couldn't be bothered to witness the birth of their grandchild. The shame was almost overwhelming, mixing with the physical pain until I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. I had always prided myself on being strong and independent, but this situation had stripped away all my defenses, leaving me raw and vulnerable in ways I had never experienced before. The baby seemed to sense my distress. taking its time to make its entrance into the world. As if it too was reluctant to be born into this atmosphere of disappointment and broken promises. Each contraction brought waves of pain that seemed to echo the emotional turmoil in my chest. And I found myself apologizing to my unborn child for the dysfunction they were about to inherit. What kind of grandparents would they have? What kind of family was I bringing them into? These questions haunted me as the labor progressed, adding layers of anxiety to an already overwhelming situation. The doctor assured me that everything was progressing normally, that the baby was healthy and strong, but I could see the concern in her eyes when she looked at my emotional state. She had probably delivered babies to teenage mothers with more family support than I was receiving. And the irony was not lost on me. I was a grown woman with supposedly loving parents. Yet I was more alone than someone half my age with no resources or support system. The realization was both heartbreaking and infuriating. And I channeled that anger into the work of bringing my child into the world. If my parents couldn't be bothered to care about this moment, then I would make sure it was beautiful and meaningful. Despite their absence, I would be the parent I wished I had, starting from this very moment. As evening approached and the hospital grew quieter, I felt a strange sense of determination growing alongside the contractions. This experience was teaching me something important about resilience and self-reliance, even if the lesson was coming at the worst possible time. I was about to become a mother, and my first act of motherhood would be to protect my child from the kind of casual cruelty that had defined my own relationship with my parents. The final hours of labor blurred together in a haze of pain, determination, and unexpected clarity. I had stopped checking my phone, stopped hoping they would change their minds and rushed to the hospital with apologies and explanations. Instead, I focused entirely on the task at hand, drawing strength from places I didn't know I possessed. Sarah stayed past her shift to be with me, holding my hand and coaching me through the breathing exercises that I should have learned in classes I was supposed to attend with my mother. The irony was bitter but somehow motivating. I was learning to be strong not because of my family's support, but in spite of their absence. When my daughter finally made her appearance at 11:47 that night, sliding into the world, with a lusty cry that filled the delivery room with life and hope, I experienced a moment of pure joy that temporarily erased all the pain and disappointment of the day. She was perfect, absolutely perfect, with tiny fingers that wrapped around mine with surprising strength and dark eyes that seemed to look directly into my soul. The doctor placed her on my chest, and I felt a love so fierce and immediate that it took my breath away. This was what unconditional love felt like, I realized. This was what it meant to put someone else's needs before your own without question or hesitation. As I held my daughter for the first time, skin to skin in the quiet intimacy of the delivery room, I made a silent promise that she would never experience the kind of abandonment I had endured that day. She would always know that she was wanted, valued, and prioritized above all else. The nurse cleaned her gently while she remained on my chest, and I marveled at how something so beautiful could emerge from such a difficult day. Sarah was crying as she watched us, and she whispered that she had never seen a stronger mother or a more beautiful baby. Her words meant more to me than any congratulations from my parents could have, because they came from someone who had actually been there, who had witnessed my struggle and celebrated my triumph. The doctor completed the delivery efficiently and professionally, but I could see the emotion in her eyes as well. She had been part of something special, she told me, something that would stay with her for a long time, not because of the medical aspects of the birth, which had been routine, but because of the courage and grace I had shown under impossible circumstances. I felt a strange mix of pride and sadness at her words. Pride because I had proven to myself that I was stronger than I had ever imagined, and sadness because it had taken such a painful experience to discover that strength. My daughter fell asleep on my chest, her breathing slow and peaceful, completely trusting in my ability to protect and care for her. That trust was both humbling and empowering, and I knew that everything in my life had changed in that moment. I was no longer just someone's daughter, subject to their whims and capable of being hurt by their selfishness. I was now a mother, with responsibilities and priorities that were crystal clear. The disappointment of my parents' absence began to transform into something else, something that felt almost like gratitude. Their betrayal had forced me to discover resources within myself that I might never have found otherwise. It had also shown me exactly what kind of parent I never wanted to be. The days following my daughter's birth were a whirlwind of new experiences, sleepless nights, and profound realizations about family, loyalty, and love. My parents, finally, showed up at the hospital 2 days later, arriving with expensive flowers and elaborate excuses about traffic and confusion about visiting hours. But their explanations fell flat in the face of what I had experienced, and I found myself looking at them as if seeing them clearly for the first time in my life. They cooed over their granddaughter with what seemed like genuine affection, taking dozens of photos and making grand pronouncements about how perfect she was, how much she looked like me at that age, how excited they were to be grandparents. But their enthusiasm felt hollow and performative, like actors playing roles they didn't quite understand. Where had this excitement been when I needed them most? Where had this love been when I was screaming in pain and begging for their support? My mother made a particular effort to explain her absence, going into elaborate detail about how exhausted she had been from her shopping expedition, how she had developed a terrible headache, how she simply couldn't function without proper rest. She spoke as if her fatigue was a medical emergency that had required immediate attention, as if missing her daughter's labor was an unfortunate but understandable consequence of her own needs. My father nodded along supportively, occasionally adding his own justifications about not wanting to disturb the medical staff or get in the way of the professionals. Their words washed over me like meaningless noise, and I realized that I no longer cared about their excuses or explanations. The damage was done, and no amount of retroactive concern could undo the abandonment I had experienced during the most important day of my life. As I watched them interact with my daughter, I felt a protective instinct that was unlike anything I had ever experienced. They had proven themselves unreliable when it mattered most, and I would never again put myself or my child in a position where their selfishness could cause such pain. The realization was both liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it freed me from years of hoping they would change, of making excuses for their behavior, of accepting treatment that I would never tolerate from anyone else. Terrifying because it meant acknowledging that I was truly on my own in this new phase of my life, that the family support I had always assumed would be there simply didn't exist in any meaningful way. Over the following weeks, as I adjusted to life as a new mother, the full impact of their betrayal continued to unfold. Friends and acquaintances would ask about my birth experience, expecting heartwarming stories about my parents' excitement and support. Instead, I found myself crafting careful responses that avoided the painful truth, protecting not just my own privacy but also my parents' reputation. Why was I still protecting them, I wondered, when they had shown so little consideration for me? The answer, I realized, was that despite everything, I still hoped for some kind of reconciliation, some acknowledgement of the pain they had caused, some genuine effort to rebuild our relationship on more honest terms. But as the weeks turned into months, it became clear that they had already moved on from the incident, treating it as a minor misunderstanding rather than a fundamental betrayal of the parent-child bond. As my daughter grew from a newborn into an alert, engaging infant, I found myself experiencing motherhood in ways I had never expected. Every milestone, from her first smile to her first laugh, was tinged with both joy and sadness. Joy because she was developing beautifully, becoming more curious and responsive each day. Sadness because I found myself thinking about how different things might have been if I had parents who were truly invested in our lives. The other mothers in my neighborhood seemed to have such different relationships with their own parents, talking casually about weekly visits, babysitting arrangements, and family traditions that spanned generations. I listened to their stories with a mixture of envy and disbelief, wondering what it would feel like to have that kind of unconditional family support. My parents made sporadic efforts to be involved, sending expensive gifts and making grand gestures that seemed designed more for their own satisfaction than for our actual needs. They would arrive unannounced with elaborate toys that were completely inappropriate for an infant, take a few photos for their social media accounts, and then leave within an hour, claiming they didn't want to overstay their welcome. Their visits always left me feeling empty and frustrated, like I was participating in some kind of performance rather than building genuine relationships. I began to understand that they saw their granddaughter as an accessory to their image of themselves as loving grandparents, rather than as a real person who needed consistent, reliable love and attention. The contrast between their superficial involvement and what I knew real grandparent relationships could be became increasingly stark as I observed other families. I watched my friend Maria's mother arrive every Tuesday with homemade soup and an eagerness to hold the baby while Maria took a shower or ran errands. I saw my neighbors' parents pick up their grandchildren from school every day, their faces lighting up with genuine pleasure at the sight of the kids running toward them. These were the kinds of relationships I had dreamed of for my daughter, the kinds of connections that I had assumed would naturally develop once she was born. Instead, I found myself building a chosen family of friends, neighbors, and even relative strangers who showed more genuine interest in our well-being than my own parents ever had. Sarah, the nurse who had stayed with me during labor, became a regular visitor, bringing her own grandchildren to play with my daughter as she grew older. The doctor who had delivered my baby sent cards on every birthday, remembering details about our lives that my own parents seemed to forget within days. These relationships, built on mutual respect and genuine care, rather than biological obligation, began to heal some of the wounds left by my parents' betrayal. I realized that family was not just about blood relationships, but about people who showed up when you needed them, who celebrated your joys and supported you through your struggles. My daughter would grow up surrounded by love and support, just not from the sources I had originally expected. The first birthday party became a defining moment in our evolving family dynamic. I had spent weeks planning a simple celebration, inviting close friends and the chosen family members who had become so important in our lives. I sent my parents an invitation, hoping that perhaps this milestone would inspire them to be more present and engaged. They responded with enthusiasm, promising to arrive early to help with preparations and to bring a special surprise for their granddaughter. I allowed myself to hope that maybe they had learned something from the mistakes of the past year, that becoming grandparents had sparked some kind of personal growth that would lead to more reliable, loving relationships. The morning of the party, I woke up early to decorate the house and prepare food, expecting my parents to arrive by 9 as promised. 9 o'clock came and went. Then 10, then 11. By noon, guests were beginning to arrive, and I was juggling hosting duties while trying to manage my growing anxiety about my parents' absence. I called them repeatedly, but their phones went straight to voicemail. Other guests began asking about the grandparents, expecting them to be the guests of honor at this celebration of their first grandchild's birthday. I made excuses and deflected questions, but inside I was reliving the same feelings of abandonment and betrayal that had defined my daughter's birth. How could they do this again? How could they make promises they had no intention of keeping, especially when it involved their granddaughter's first birthday? As the party continued and my daughter played happily with the other children, blissfully unaware of the drama surrounding her grandparents' absence, I felt something shift inside me. The disappointment was still there, but it was accompanied by a strange sense of relief. I no longer had to wonder whether they would show up or let us down. I no longer had to manage my expectations or make excuses for their behavior. They had shown me, once again, exactly who they were and what their priorities were. The party was actually more relaxed and enjoyable without the underlying tension of wondering how they would behave or what drama they might create. My chosen family rallied around us, taking extra photos, making speeches about what a wonderful mother I was, and ensuring that my daughter felt completely celebrated and loved. Sarah brought a beautiful handmade quilt that she had been working on for months, explaining each patch and its significance. Other friends contributed homemade gifts, heartfelt cards, and most importantly, their consistent presence and support. As I watched my daughter take her first tentative steps during the party, surrounded by people who had chosen to be part of our lives and who showed up reliably with love and encouragement, I realized that we had everything we needed. The absence of my parents no longer felt like a devastating loss, but rather like a clarification of what real family looked like. My parents finally called that evening, full of apologies and explanations about a last-minute emergency that had prevented them from attending. But their excuses sounded rehearsed and hollow, and I found myself responding with polite acknowledgement rather than the emotional devastation that would have characterized my reaction in the past. I was learning to protect my heart and my daughter's future by accepting the reality of who my parents were rather than continuing to hope they would become who I needed them to be. The conversation that finally changed everything happened on a rainy Tuesday afternoon when my daughter was 18 months old. She had been walking for months, chattering in her own language, and developing the kind of personality that made everyone who met her smile. I was exhausted from a particularly difficult night of teething and sleep disruption. When my mother called with what she described as wonderful news, she and my father had decided to take a 3-week cruise through the Mediterranean, she announced excitedly, and they wanted to spend time with their granddaughter before they left. Could they take her for the weekend so they could bond properly? The audacity of the request left me speechless for several seconds. Here were people who couldn't be relied upon to show up for major milestones, who had abandoned me during childbirth and missed their granddaughter's first birthday. asking to take responsibility for my toddler for an entire weekend. The presumption that they were entitled to such a privilege, despite their track record of unreliability, was breathtaking in its self-centeredness. I found my voice and began to explain why that wouldn't be possible, listing the many ways they had proven themselves untrustworthy and unreliable, but my mother interrupted me with a tone of injured innocence that I had heard countless times throughout my childhood. I was being unfair, she claimed. I was holding grudges over minor misunderstandings. I was denying them the opportunity to build a relationship with their granddaughter over petty grievances that should have been forgiven and forgotten long ago. Her words triggered something deep inside me, a rage that had been building for nearly 2 years but had never found full expression. I began to speak, calmly at first but with increasing intensity, about what their absence during labor had meant to me. I described the physical pain of contractions combined with the emotional devastation of realizing that my own parents had chosen a nap over being present for one of the most important moments of my life. I explained how their continued pattern of broken promises and casual abandonment had affected not just me, but my ability to trust and form healthy relationships with others. I told them about the shame I felt when other people asked about their involvement in our lives, about the elaborate stories I had created to avoid admitting that my own parents were essentially absent by choice. My mother's response was everything I had expected and everything that confirmed my worst fears about our relationship. Instead of acknowledging the pain they had caused or expressing any genuine remorse, she became defensive and accusatory. I was being dramatic, she insisted. Childbirth was a natural process that didn't require family involvement. She had needed her rest after a tiring day, and any reasonable person would understand that. Besides, everything had worked out fine, hadn't it? The baby was healthy. I had survived the experience, and there was no point in dwelling on ancient history. Her dismissal of my pain was so complete, so casual, that I felt something break inside me. Not my heart this time, but rather the chains of obligation and hope that had kept me tethered to a relationship that had never served my best interests. I realized that I had been waiting my entire adult life for them to acknowledge my worth, to prioritize my needs, to show up for me in meaningful ways, but they were simply not capable of that kind of love or commitment. And continuing to hope for change was only setting myself and my daughter up for continued disappointment and pain. The months following that conversation were both difficult and liberating as I navigated the process of establishing boundaries with my parents and explaining our changing relationship to friends and extended family members. Some people understood immediately, having witnessed similar dynamics in their own families or having observed my parents' behavior over the years. Others were more skeptical, suggesting that family relationships required compromise and forgiveness, that cutting off grandparents was harmful to children, that I should try harder to work things out for my daughter's sake. These well-meaning but misguided opinions forced me to articulate more clearly why protecting my daughter from unreliable, self-centered people was actually an act of love rather than spite. I began to research the psychological effects of inconsistent caregiving on children, learning about attachment theory and the importance of predictable, trustworthy relationships in early development. What I discovered confirmed my instincts about protecting my daughter from the kind of emotional whiplash that had characterized my own childhood. Children needed to know that the adults in their lives could be counted on, that promises would be kept, that their needs would be prioritized. My parents had proven repeatedly that they could not provide that kind of stability, and exposing my daughter to their unreliability would only teach her to accept inconsistent love as normal. The decision to limit contact was not made in anger or spite, but from a place of protective love and hard-won wisdom about what healthy relationships actually looked like. My parents' reaction to these boundaries was predictably dramatic and self-centered. They accused me of being vindictive and cruel, of using their granddaughter as a weapon to punish them for minor mistakes. They enlisted other family members to pressure me into changing my mind, painting themselves as the victims of an ungrateful daughter who had forgotten everything they had done for me over the years. Their inability to take responsibility for their actions or to acknowledge the legitimate pain they had caused only confirmed that I was making the right decision. If they could not even admit that their behavior had been hurtful, there was no possibility of genuine change or improvement in our relationship. Meanwhile, my daughter continued to thrive, surrounded by the love and consistency of our chosen family. She formed strong bonds with Sarah and the other adults who had stepped into grandparent-like roles, learning to trust that the people who loved her would show up when they said they would. She never asked about my parents because she had never experienced their absence as a loss. The family she knew was reliable, present, and genuinely invested in her well-being. Watching her develop secure attachments with trustworthy adults reinforced my conviction that I had made the right choice, even when that choice was difficult and painful. As her second birthday approached, I felt a sense of peace and resolution that had been missing from my life for years. We would celebrate surrounded by people who had earned their place in our lives through consistent love and support. People who understood that family was defined by actions rather than biology. The pain of my parents' betrayal during my labor had transformed into something valuable, the wisdom to recognize healthy love and the courage to insist on nothing less for myself and my daughter. Looking back now, as my daughter approaches her third birthday, I can see how profoundly that experience in the delivery room changed the trajectory of our lives. What felt like the worst betrayal imaginable at the time became the catalyst for building a life based on authentic relationships and healthy boundaries. My daughter is thriving in ways that might not have been possible if we had remained entangled in the dysfunction of my original family system. She knows she is loved unconditionally by people who choose to be present in her life, who celebrate her milestones without fail, who provide the kind of consistent support that every child deserves. The chosen family we have built includes Sarah, who has become the grandmother my daughter calls Nana Sarah, and who never misses an important moment. It includes our neighbors, the Johnsons, whose own children are grown but who treat my daughter like another grandchild, teaching her to garden and sharing stories from their own parenting adventures. It includes my friend Maria and her mother, who have included us in their weekly family dinners and holiday celebrations, showing my daughter what multi-generational love looks like when it's genuine and reliable. These relationships were not forced or obligated, but grew naturally from mutual care and respect. They have taught me that love is not about blood relations or biological connections, but about people who show up consistently, who keep their promises, who prioritize the well-being of those they claim to care about. My daughter is learning these lessons without the confusion and pain that characterized my own childhood. She expects reliability from the adults in her life because that is what she has always experienced. She knows that when someone says they will be somewhere, they will be there. She understands that her needs and feelings matter because the people who love her have always treated them as important. These may seem like basic expectations, but they are actually profound gifts that will serve her well throughout her life. The trauma of being abandoned during labor has been transformed into wisdom about the difference between people who say they love you and people who actually show up with love. I no longer waste emotional energy hoping for change from people who have repeatedly demonstrated their incapacity for reliable affection. Instead, I invest in relationships that nourish and sustain us, that contribute positively to our lives, that model healthy love for my daughter. Sometimes I wonder what might have happened if my parents had made different choices. If they had rushed to the hospital that day, if they had been present for the important moments that followed. But I no longer feel sadness about those alternative possibilities. The path we ended up on, difficult as it was initially, led us to a life filled with authentic love and genuine support. My daughter will never know the pain of being abandoned by people who are supposed to love her unconditionally. Because I learned to recognize that pattern and break it before it could affect her. That may be the most important gift I can give her, the knowledge that she deserves consistent, reliable love, and the courage to insist on nothing less. The third birthday celebration became a testament to how far we had come and how complete our chosen family had become. Unlike the anxiety-filled first birthday where I still harbored hopes for my parents' participation, this celebration was planned with pure joy and anticipation. I knew exactly who would be there, exactly who we could count on, and exactly how loved my daughter would feel surrounded by people who had proven their commitment to us time and again. The morning dawned bright and clear, and I felt a sense of peace that would have seemed impossible during those dark hours in the delivery room 3 years earlier. Sarah arrived early as promised, carrying a homemade cake decorated with butterflies that my daughter had been obsessing over for weeks. The Johnsons brought their famous potato salad and stories about their own grandchildren's birthday parties, immediately making my daughter feel like the center of a large, loving family. Maria's mother came with her entire extended family, treating our celebration as if it were their own family gathering, which in many ways it had become. As I watched my daughter blow out her 3 candles, her face glowing with happiness and security, I felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the journey that had brought us here. She was surrounded by adults who had chosen to love her, who had invested in her happiness, who had shown up consistently for every important moment of her short life. She didn't know that other children had biological grandparents who were supposed to fill these roles, and she didn't feel any sense of loss or absence. Her world was complete, her family was exactly as it should be, and her understanding of love was based on reliability and genuine care rather than obligation or biology. The contrast between this celebration and the painful experiences of her birth and first birthday was stark and meaningful. I had learned to stop waiting for people who would never show up and instead to treasure the ones who always did. The transformation in my own emotional state was equally dramatic. Where I had once felt shame about my parents' absence, I now felt pride in the family we had created. Where I had once made excuses for their behavior, I now spoke openly about the importance of choosing relationships that served us well. Where I had once hoped for change that would never come, I now invested energy in nurturing the connections that had already proven their worth. My daughter's third birthday party was not just a celebration of her life, but a celebration of our growth, our healing, and our commitment to building a future based on authentic love, rather than empty promises. The little girl who had entered the world amid betrayal and abandonment was now thriving in an environment of consistent support and unconditional acceptance. She was learning lessons about her own worth that I had taken decades to understand, and she was developing expectations for relationships that would protect her throughout her life. As the party wound down and our chosen family helped clean up, sharing stories and making plans for future gatherings, I realized that we had not just survived my parents' betrayal, we had used it as a foundation for something much better than what we had lost. The pain of that day in the delivery room had been transformed into wisdom, strength, and an unshakable commitment to authentic relationships. My daughter would grow up knowing exactly what real love looked like because she had never known anything else. The unexpected encounter happened on a Tuesday afternoon at the grocery store when my daughter was 3.5 years old. We were in the cereal aisle, with her chattering happily about the different cartoon characters on the boxers, when I heard a familiar voice behind me. My mother's voice, higher pitched than usual with what sounded like nervous excitement. I turned around to find both my parents standing there with uncertain smiles, looking older than I remembered and somehow smaller than they had seemed in my memories. My daughter, who had never met them and had no context for who they were, looked up at them with the polite curiosity she showed all strangers. The moment was surreal and charged with an emotional complexity that I hadn't anticipated. My first instinct was protective. A fierce desire to shield my daughter from people who had proven themselves untrustworthy and unreliable. But there was also a strange sadness, seeing these two people who had once been central to my life now, standing before us as virtual strangers to their own granddaughter. They began speaking in the overly enthusiastic tones that adults use with children they don't know well, asking my daughter about her age, complimenting her dress, trying to establish some kind of connection with a child who had no reason to respond to them with anything more than polite wariness. She stayed close to my side, occasionally glancing up at me for reassurance about these unfamiliar adults, who seemed to know her name and were showing an inexplicably intense interest in her responses. My mother's eyes filled with tears as she looked at my daughter, and I could see her struggling with the reality that she was essentially a stranger to her own granddaughter. This was the consequence of her choices, the natural result of prioritizing her comfort over our relationship. But I could see that she hadn't fully understood what she had given up until this moment. My father seemed equally uncomfortable, making awkward small talk about the weather and the grocery store, clearly unsure how to navigate this unexpected encounter. The conversation was stilted and painful, filled with the weight of everything that had been left unsaid and all the time that had been lost. They asked if we could talk, if we could work things out, if there was a way to move forward for the sake of family. But as I looked at my daughter, who was now tugging on my hand and asking if we could go look at the toys, I realized that the time for those conversations had passed. She had a complete, loving family that didn't include them, and introducing chaos and uncertainty into her stable world would serve no one's interests but theirs. I responded politely but firmly, explaining that we were doing well and that we needed to continue with our shopping. The disappointment in their faces was genuine, and for a moment I felt a flicker of the old guilt, the familiar urge to prioritize their feelings over my own judgment. But then my daughter squeezed my hand trustingly, and I remembered all the lessons I had learned about protecting her from people who couldn't be relied upon to put her needs first. We said goodbye and walked away, leaving them standing in the cereal aisle with their regrets and their belated understanding of what their choices had cost them. That night, after my daughter was asleep, I called Sarah and told her about the encounter. She listened quietly, offering no advice or judgment, just the steady presence that had sustained me through so many difficult moments. We talked about forgiveness and boundaries, about the difference between holding grudges and protecting yourself from repeated harm, about the responsibility I had to my daughter to maintain the stability and security she had always known. Years have passed since that encounter in the grocery store, and my daughter is now a confident, secure teenager who has never questioned the love and support of her chosen family. She calls Sarah Nana with the same natural affection that other children reserve for biological grandparents. And she has grown up understanding that family is defined by love and commitment, rather than genetic connections. The Johnsons taught her to garden and helped her build a treehouse in our backyard. Maria's mother taught her to cook traditional recipes and shared stories about her own childhood that became part of my daughter's sense of family history. These relationships, built on mutual respect and genuine affection, have given her a foundation of security that I never experienced in my own childhood. She has never known the anxiety of wondering whether the adults in her life will show up when they say they will, because everyone in her world has proven their reliability countless times over. The lessons she learned from our chosen family have shaped her into someone who expects consistency and kindness from the people she allows into her life. Someone who recognizes authentic love and has the courage to walk away from relationships that don't serve her well. Recently, she asked me about my parents, having heard references to them from extended family members at school functions. I told her the truth in age-appropriate terms, explaining that some people are not able to be reliable family members, and that we had chosen to build our family with people who could be trusted to show up with love and support. She listened thoughtfully and then asked if I was sad about not having parents in my life. I realized as I answered that I wasn't sad anymore, hadn't been for years. The space in my life that might have been filled by unreliable parents was instead occupied by people who had chosen to love us consistently and well. The betrayal that had felt so devastating in that delivery room had ultimately led us to something much better than what we had lost. My daughter will never experience the confusion of loving someone who hurts you repeatedly, the exhaustion of hoping for change that never comes, the shame of making excuses for people who don't deserve your loyalty. She will enter adulthood with clear expectations for how she should be treated and the confidence to surround herself with people who meet those standards. The gift of that clarity, born from my own painful experience, may be the most valuable thing I can give her. Sometimes I think about the woman I was in that delivery room, screaming in pain and abandoned by people who claimed to love me. She couldn't have imagined that her worst day would become the foundation for her daughter's best life. The betrayal that broke my heart open also let in light that had never been there before, illuminating the difference between people who say they love you and people who show up with love. That distinction has made all the difference in the life we have built together, surrounded by chosen family who understand that love is a verb, not just a feeling. My daughter's childhood has been filled with adults who kept their promises, celebrated her achievements, and provided comfort during difficult times. She has learned that she deserves nothing less than complete, reliable love, and she has the wisdom to recognize it when she finds it.